Hi everybody, this is Anne. When I used to take on new hand building students, I would start them with simple, non-complex projects where they could explore the characteristics of clay with some success. Slowly I introduced pieces with more complexity which required some creative troubleshooting for straight walls, but also to avoid cracking and warping. In this video, I'll show you 3 potentially tricky projects and share with you my 10 best defensive maneuvers to avoid those pottery pitfalls. By the way, I've included links to all the templates you'll see in this video in the description section. The straight cylinder is one of the best examples of the basic form. There are no complicated curves or angles to deal with. Keeping the rim round is probably going to be your main issue here. Let's add a level of difficulty to the straight cylinder by angling out the walls and also adding a recessed bottom. Here are the template pieces, and I'll also use a styrofoam cone that'll work as a mold. I rolled out a 1/4 inch clay slab and ribbed both sides. I cut out each of the template pieces. I'm going to want to join these pieces together, which brings me to the first tip. I use this beveling tool on the edges, which I've found to give me the most uniform seams. This tool has a 45 and a 30-degree option. Using the 45-degree angle side, I held it flat to the short edge of the half-circle piece, then slid it down the side. I turned the piece over and beveled the other short side. Since the walls will be flared outward, it works best for me to bevel the circular bottom piece too. In hindsight, it'd probably have worked better to cut this on the banding wheel, but it doesn't matter. Just make sure the piece is still round. Now I can score each beveled edge. Now I'll slip one of the edges, then join the two together. Now I turn the piece over and make sure the edges are secure and the rim is round. Next, I put the bottom section on the banding wheel in the very center. I scored the edge of that and the bottom edge of the wall. I slipped one edge and attached the two together. Here's the second tip to prevent cracking. Place a coil along vulnerable seams. I did it here and worked it into the wall while supporting the outside. Now I can use my red rib along the inner clay surface while turning the wheel to create a symmetrically angled wall. Using my needle tool, grounded by a paintbrush, I held it against the side of the rim and cut away any uneven areas. I use my fingers to flatten the top of the rim. Now let's work on the frustum part. Leaving the plastic over the cone, I follow the same steps for beveling, scoring, and slipping and fitting the slab around the cone. I use my red rib to smooth the joint. Now I can turn it over and make sure the bottom of the seam is secure. Also notice that I cut away the plastic from the bottom of the styrofoam cone. I did that so I can turn the whole thing over and slide the cone right out. Then I can peel away the plastic. I added a coil to the inner seam, but if you have a good seal, that's optional. Now I scored the bottom of both sections, slipped one side, and attached the two together. I used the bottom edge of a paintbrush to smooth and create a tight inner seam. I ran a rubber rib around the outer wall for a better connection and to make it as symmetrical as I could. There's always a chance that the seam will create warping during firing, so I'll flare the clay outward along the rim to decrease that chance. This stretch will help keep the clay from wanting to flatten back out. I started this with my fingers, but switched to the rubber rib for the most symmetry. Your clay wall may also want to flatten back out as the clay dries. So to help prevent this, I rolled a strip of a plastic placemat into a tight coil, then slowly let it unfurl so that it placed tension against the clay to keep it round. Here are a couple examples that are all decorated and fired. They stayed pretty round. You would think they were thrown on the wheel. Let's tackle another difficult shape, the oval. I'm going to hand build one using a template, but if you can find an oval bowl without a foot ring like this little cutie, using that as a drape mold's the easiest for beginners to get started. Again, I rolled out a slab and cut out the pieces. This time, I beveled the short ends of each wall piece, then scored and slipped them. I turned over one of the pieces and attached the two sides, making sure the connections were nice and tight. I turned those pieces over and smoothed out the joints along the back side too. That brings us to our next tip. Complete the rest of the construction process on a movable surface like a bat. Once I get the piece nicely formed with straight walls, using this tip will help me keep my hands off of it. I simply scored and slipped the inner walls of both slabs, then fit the wall section over the floor. That is so satisfying for some reason. I work the seams together well. If you need to, add a coil to strengthen the joint. I then used a red rubber rib along the walls to round and smooth them. I used wet fingers to round the edge. The biggest trouble spot for my oval dishes are about 90% of my porcelain rims warp when they're fired. To minimize this, I intentionally warp the rim by creatively fluting it. Even if the clay were to stretch out more in the kiln, it wouldn't be as noticeable. I simply mark the areas, then use my fingers to form the flutes. Once you have the rim the way you want it, tip number 7 is to check that both wall sides flare outward and the height of the walls are even. I do this with a level. I checked both from side to side and from end to end. When I finally get it just the way I want it, hands off. I just move the whole bat right to the shelf to dry. Here it is, all dried and decorated. If you're still having trouble with your oval dishes, my suggestion is to get creative. I changed my oval template into 3 vertical strips, where the short ends of the templates are not identical. This way, it doesn't matter if the clay warps, because visually the shape is not totally symmetrical anyway. And plus, I think it looks pretty cool. I found this cool plastic leaf-shaped bowl in the Goodwill store. The best part was that it had no foot ring, so I could use it as a drape mold. I can already see that stretching the clay into those tight folds can make it vulnerable to cracking. First, I covered it with plastic to keep the two from sticking together. I then covered the mold with a 1/4-inch clay slab. I began finding the edges gently with my fingers. I want to avoid overly stretching and thinning out the clay, so I push the excess clay inward towards the tight folds, giving slack to the clay in preparation for molding. Creating slack will help, but these areas are so tight, I decided to take one more precaution from cracking. I added little bits of clay into each crevice. I cut the excess clay away. After making sure I got a good impression of the outer edges, I then turned the whole thing over. You'll see an image of the outer edge. This is where I can make my final cuts to create a nice rim. I wet my fingers, then smoothed and rounded the rim. In my experience, there's still a chance the clay will want to crack at those tighter folds, so I work a little more clay into them. Finally, I lightly cover all my pieces with plastic so they'll dry slowly and further minimize warping and cracking. Here's one I made earlier that I started decorating. I just underglazed this simple pattern over the surface for this lovely look. These tips work well for me, and hopefully some of the tips will work well for you. Thanks to the newest members of our Little Street Pottery Research Facility team. If you'd like to join the team and earn a title, click on the Super Thanks button or the link to buy me a coffee. It also really helps us out if you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. See you next time in the studio.